World War III has long been considered sort of a catalyst for the Great Reset. The Gulf of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the world. 20% of the world's oil goes through that passageway. We've been giving a lot of thought to what happens if they close that strait. You get into fragmentation of the market, every country for themselves. There are no winners in that. It's just spreading the loss around. It's hard to imagine that the debt-laden Western economies are going to survive the economic convulsions that would come from $150, $200, $300 a barrel. There are no good scenarios in a super spike of oil. When the lifeblood of humanity gets radically expensive, life stops. You push Iran to the brink. What's to stop them from pressing that button? Because if they're going to go down, you may as well bring everybody else with them.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel, once again, we have Doomberg, the popular anonymous voice dissecting the intersection of energy, economics, and geopolitics as geopolitical tensions escalate around the world and World War III scenarios inch closer to reality. Doomberg offers critical insights into how energy, policy, and geopolitical missteps are shaping our future. Now, as we speak, at the time of making this video, Trump is in the Situation Room discussing what the next step will be in the war. Doomberg is an energy expert. And if you don't know, his claim to fame is the anonymity of it all, a massive following on Substack. So go and check that out. A lot of inside information with respect to the oil markets. And I wanted to have you on today to talk about what the potential effects on the energy industry are going to be. Because it seems that the energy markets are surprisingly subdued, considering at the time that we speak, we've just had a couple oil tankers mysteriously go up in flames in the Gulf of Oman, which they're chalking up to a collision. However, it's kind of suspicious. It could possibly be some GPS spoofing, hacking, something to that effect. We have embassies vacating. We have military bases emptying out of their major equipment throughout the Middle East. We have the forward deployment of hundreds, if not thousands, of high-end military assets to the region. And it appears as though war is inevitable. Yet oil is seemingly subdued, only moving up 20% so far. Now, I say only. Markets nowadays are incredibly fickle. And we know that they're not really tethered in reality. But what is your take on, let's just start with, your assessment of the situation as it stands, and then maybe you can tease apart what the outcomes will be for oil.
Yeah, great set of questions, Nate. And first, thanks for having me back on. And probably not the type of congratulations you wanted to hear, but I did want to acknowledge that unlike us, you have been calling that there would be hostilities between Israel, backed by the U.S., and Iran for some time. We didn't think such a war would break out because we thought the missile counterattack by Iran on October 1st of last year demonstrated Israel's unique vulnerabilities. Clearly, that analysis was incorrect. As it pertains to oil, look, the Gulf of Hormuz is one of the most important choke points in the world. Just to give your viewers some numbers, 30% of the world's oil is produced in the Middle East, and 2/3 of that goes through that passageway. So 20% of the world's oil goes through that strait, and that strait can be shut down, and not even necessarily through direct military means, just the credible threat of military action against tankers and LNG carriers, liquefied natural gas carriers, will cause insurance companies to forbid the owners of those tankers and LNG carriers to float through it. And that would be significant because it's not just oil. 20% of the world's LNG comes from Qatar, and Ras Tanura is on the wrong side of the strait. One of the most important energy epicenters in global trade that very few people probably have ever heard of.
What is it called?
Ras Tanura is Qatar's major LNG production and export facility. And if you look it up on a map, you can see where it is. And that's a giant natural gas field, the largest in the world, that Qatar shares with Iran, by the way. And Israel has already targeted Iran's side of that operation, although it doesn't look like extensive damage was done. Now, to your point about the oil markets, we too were surprised at their relative calm in the face of what we both think could very quickly escalate to incredibly dangerous times. Having said that, we've done some more thinking and run the numbers. Prior to the war, we had sort of calibrated that the equilibrium price of oil, all things being equal, should be about $55 a barrel. And right now, as we're talking, it's running a bit, and WTI is trading at 77. So $22 of risk premium is pretty substantial. And of course, you have to always price in the fact that Trump could cut a deal and suddenly, all of that premium comes out all at once. And so it's not a risk-free trade to just get long oil and assume World War III is going to happen, although I do think it is increasingly likely, and markets are signaling that. We arrive at that $55 number just by multiplying what landed LNG would need to be for people to make money and multiply that by 5.5. And we pick $10 per million BTU of landed LNG as that sort of equilibrium number. And that's where things were headed before the war, in part, though, because OPEC had these mysterious production increases after Trump visited the Middle East. They don't look so mysterious anymore.
No, they clearly are preempting. They clearly preempted something. And a friend of mine, we were kind of debating, because he claims that before wars happen, they typically crash the price of oil in anticipation in order to mitigate, the economic fallout. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what James Baker did before the first Gulf War, except it was done in public. This, if correct, implies a couple of important things. One, Trump knew about it and blessed it long before it happened, notwithstanding Secretary of State's initial denials, which Trump, of course, personally undid on Truth Social. But also, Iran's neighbors were aware and must have signed off on it, and the fact that, Israeli and U.S. aircraft are freely flying over these countries. It's not really just Israel in a war with Iran. It's Israel backed by the United States directly and so at least indirectly by Saudi Arabia and so on. And so that has to fit into Iran's calculus as it ponders next steps. Now, we've been giving a lot of thought to what happens if they close that strait, because it's not necessarily as simple as you might imagine. And one of the things that we're following very closely is the difference between WTI oil and Brent oil. And as at a crude level, you could say that WTI is sort of US-based oil and Brent is international oil or European oil. You could see those diverge if they do close the strait, because there's a scenario where the US does not export and keeps energy for the home front, the US, Canada, Mexico, the North American nexus. We could go down that rabbit hole, but there's all kinds of scenarios where the Europeans are really, really hurt as a result of it. The Chinese are hurt, but then by extension, so are all of its neighbors. Because even though China is short crude, it's a major refiner of crude, converting it into gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. And the US is a major refiner and a net exporter of refined fuels. But if the global gasoline price goes to $10 a gallon, there's no way Trump's going to let Americans pay that. And so then you're going to have significant war powers intervention in the energy markets, and there won't be a global price of oil.
So how would that affect the petrodollar?
World War III is long been considered sort of a catalyst for the Great Reset, doing things in weeks that would normally take decades. Very difficult to model. Obviously, gold is not signaling World War III at the moment, which is interesting, and stocks aren't signaling World War III at the moment either, which is bizarre considering that the U.S. is assembling what amounts to 3 carrier fleets in the Middle East, and usually when they're all there at the same time, they're not there to just look around.
Well, I mean, stocks are, I think at this point in time, completely detached from reality. But what happens to the petrodollar if the U.S. nationalizes the oil price? Well,
it would be considered temporary, and to unseat the U.S. dollar from its position in global trade is happening, of course, slowly. I noted with interest that gold is now the second most widely held reserve asset, passing the euro, second only to the U.S. dollar. But for the U.S., I mean, if you just think politically, I don't think Trump is going to do that calculation. He's just going to say we're going to make sure that American consumers, and of course, probably by extension, Canadian consumers, are insulated from the global price shock. But then who isn't insulated is the question, and I think it's Europe predominantly and China secondarily. So to your question about the US dollar, however, all of this, of course, makes it risky to put your reserves in treasuries, for example, because after having confiscated Russian reserves and now, of course, threatening to go to war with China and sanctioning Iran up and down, anybody who may run afoul of US foreign policy is, of course, going to be thinking about parking the imbalances that they may accrue from international trade into more neutral reserve assets. I think that's why gold has gone on its run since the war in Ukraine broke out. But if you just go around the world right now and you look at the energy self-sufficient countries, it's the Middle East, it's Russia, and it's North America. And there will be a fragmentation of energy. Like you're not going to allow your national oil company, if you're Russia, to export to the detriment of your local population or your military needs onto the market. You're going to make sure that domestic demand is fulfilled at reasonable prices. You can't let market forces operate in this way. It's certainly not how World War II was fought, for example. And so this fact that we have a global economy with efficient pricing and arbitrage, that is a product of peace. And that goes away in a world war, in our view. And how to model all that out is actually pretty complicated, because then you start to think about second and third order impacts. But if you're a tanker or you're an LNG carrier, you're a floating bomb. You're not going to go anywhere near that strait. Not even just because your insurance provider forbids you. You don't want to be on a tanker that gets hit with a missile that the Houthis might lob in, or the Iranians themselves.
Yeah, and really the Houthis already kind of established a precedent for that, and presumably Iran has far better capabilities. Even one Shahed drone, well placed, I presume, could cause a massive catastrophe on a tanker.
I could not agree more. In fact, that's why we erroneously thought that cooler heads would prevail, because that October 1st strike by Iran proved that they could break through the Iron Dome and David Sling and Arrow and all their defenses. And as we wrote in that piece called October Surprise, because we were surprised that Israeli air defense performed comparatively poorer, at least when comparing to reputation and prior performance. There's only really 5 power plants in Israel that produce most of their electricity. There's 5 desalination plants that produce most of their drinking water. There's 2 natural gas fields that produce all of their natural gas. Natural gas is a big part of their energy mix. That's like a dozen targets, and everybody knows where they are. They're geolocated. And if Israeli air defense is incapable of stopping all the missiles, and we're still seeing strikes today, almost a week on, and there's some of them at least seem to be getting through. It's very difficult to tell, of course, because both Israel and Iran have implemented strict censorship, and there's a lot of propaganda and fake images on the internet, as I'm sure you're doing the same thing we're trying to do, is trying to figure out what's going on and what's real, trying to separate the signal from the vast ocean of noise that is Twitter and Reddit and Telegram and all those channels. But it does seem as though this was always planned to be a quick decapitation strike, and it doesn't look like it has succeeded. And if that's the case, it's very difficult to imagine scenarios, even with U.S. involvement, where Israel can persist in its current form in a long war of attrition with a much more formidable adversary. And I do think, look, we caught some heat. We wrote a piece on this. War is emotional, especially for those directly involved. We're not directly involved. We're just trying to figure out what's going on and what it means for our subscribers. Wars are a lot easier to start than they are to end. And, it is amazing that here we are in 2025, as we were saying before we hit record, that John Bolton and Lindsey Graham, and I'm waiting for Dick Cheney to make an appearance. It's weapons of mass destruction. This is the same old tapes that you and I have been seeing for 30 years. They're not even creative.
No,
and I watched with amazement.
A whole new generation has allowed.
Yeah.
So a new generation can now be exposed to the old playbook, and
it's amazing.
Unknowingly.
And watching Senator Cruz, getting destroyed by Tucker Carlson. It's amazing how little thought. It's just like reflex. Let's go to war. Let's bomb Iran.
It's incredible that he didn't know the simplest of demographic facts.
And I watched it. It didn't feel like Tucker was laying a gotcha trap.
No.
It's just, I think Tucker was amazed at how little Ted Cruz how little thought he had actually given to the whole adventure. And anybody who watched that interview objectively, I mean, you got to come away pretty scared actually of this whole
Well, it
neocon
makes you
movement.
wonder, what else don't they know? If these are the people who are making policy, I presume that the intelligence, end of things has a handle on the situation. But clearly, our political elites are completely oblivious to the most basic of information. What we're entering a world of AI and all of these things, and these are the people who are running the show.
Yeah.
Like that's scary.
Well, I mean, let me give you some scarier thoughts. So first of all, this is how we ended up digging into the war in Russia-Ukraine, because we had studied how terrible the European leaders had bungled their energy policy, and that they're the same people structuring the military response and the sanctions response against Russia. And when we uncovered what was actually going on, they were Ted Cruz's. I mean, there was no there behind like a secret door where all the brains are. And here's okay, let's take like the last two major events, which you've covered extensively. The drone attack on Russia's strategic nuclear bombers and the initial decapitation strikes in Iran had very similar features, right? Mm-hmm. You've got penetrated into the country, drones in trucks, positioning themselves near military bases. You don't think China could do that here? Hasn't already done that here? Mm-hmm. Container ships, all the land they bought next to military bases. I mean, the world has changed dramatically. Those two attacks, the Ukrainian attack, presumably with British intelligence support, if you believe Russia's claims, and then the Mossad attack on Iran, those are precedents now, right? Like the START treaty's gone, and the United Nations is irrelevant. We're entering into a very different world.
I agree 100%. And just so we can anchor this video in time so people know where we're at, it is June 19th. We'll release this video today. Last night, there was an attack on Israel. It's hard to say because of the fog of war what the truth really was, what the actual target was. Israel puts their launchers in Tel Aviv. So Iran, if they want to target the air defense, they have to go for the city. And apparently a hospital was collateral damage or directly hit, depending on who you want to believe. Regardless, though, it looks like the defense minister there, Katz, is all in now. And as we said at the beginning of this video, Trump is in the talking with his national security advisors. The Doomsday plane is in Washington for the first time since September 2001, and it appears at this point to be a foregone conclusion, because I think if the United States wanted to pull back from the brink, all Trump would have to say is, look, we're not going to defend you if you continue to escalate. And they're clearly not doing that. And I think the narrative is going to shift to, now we have to come and help the Israelis. Like, I think this is almost certain at this point. I'm just waiting for I'm religiously paying attention to X and Telegram here to see what's going on as we speak. But okay, so we know that there's going to be some pretty major events that unfold here in the next week or so. If the Strait of Hormuz thing goes down, is there alternate routes that how does this oil get rerouted?
It kind of really doesn't. I mean, there's estimates of sort of a total pipeline capacity out of the region. I've seen them anywhere between 3 and 5 million barrels. Who knows if how much of that is already full. There was recently, and we wrote about it a few months ago, a seminal moment where Iran and China connected themselves via rail. And, we wondered whether that might make war with Iran inevitable. This was on May 9th. We published a piece called Lyme's Disease. And this railroad just completed, but of course it could be easily bombed in a war. But that railroad basically represented an assault on U.S. control over the seas and how much that mattered, because now you could move oil and cargo back and forth directly through friendly countries between Iran and China. So it's not like we were caught completely flat-footed. We just thought that given Israel's vulnerabilities, and when we dissected what happened in our most previous piece that is still posted at the top of our page, we settled on the conclusion that Israel must have assumed it could take out Iran's missile launch capacity in that initial strike. And clearly they have not done that based on the hospital footage that I've seen as well that you referenced earlier. It's clear that missiles are still being launched and at least some of them are getting through. And one wonders how long that can go on. And perhaps this is why Trump is behaving quite chaotically, I think. If you just look at his Truth Social posts, they're not exactly what US presidents should be doing, I don't think. But that's saying it sort of kindly. And who knows, like you say, we're both sitting here waiting to see what happens out of the Situation Room. I think as at least as fast as Twitter will be the oil markets, and that's what I have open on my screen. So between the two of us, we have it covered.
The strategic oil reserve was up to 400 million. Do you think they're going to keep filling it up at these prices, or was that an attempt to maybe front run all of this as well and prepare? And how much of an effect can that really have if things get out of control? Yeah.
So again, this is really, if the key, strait is closed, that's something that the U.S. can do. And I'm just pulling up the numbers so that we're current and see how much is in there. But the
400 million, I think.
Yeah, I'm just going to pull it up because I have it on my screen here. Yeah. So it's about 400 million barrels. The last time when war started between Russia and Ukraine, remember, Biden released 1 million barrels a day for 6 months from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And that cut it by more than a third, right? We're talking 20 million barrels a day. Like there's no band-aiding 20 million barrels a day from anybody's reserves. And in fact, at 20 million barrels a day, which I don't even think it'd be physically possible to pump oil out of the reserve at those rates, it becomes basically all bets off. The number is 402 million barrels a day as of the time of this recording. 402 million barrels total as of the time of this recording. I just pulled it up. And so there's no replacing 20 million barrels a day. That's like full tilt, divided by zero kind of number. And so then you get into fragmentation of the market, every country for themselves, with severe winners and severe losers. Look, let's just talk China. China only produces 4 million barrels a day, but can refine up to 18 million barrels a day, and it has thus made itself essential to all of its neighbors because it produces diesel and gasoline and jet fuel, not just for its domestic markets, but also for its neighbors. And if China has positioned itself such that if its refineries do not get supplied, it isn't the only country that gets burned, pun intended. And so there's a bit of a game of chicken going on too. Because again, China pulls its refineries down, then there's a mad dash for gasoline and diesel and jet fuel all around the world. And that's where I think protectionist policies by the US, who can refine about as much and routinely refines more than China, come into play. And so there would be probably domestic rationing, price controls domestically, and then refiners would be allowed to participate in the global markets once U.S. consumer and military needs were more than taken care of, and perhaps augmented by releasing the strategic petroleum reserves. But if the Chinese refineries are down, this is you can't even model it, Nate. It's truly like event horizon type stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, let's talk about China in a minute. I just have one more question on the American home front. How will this affect? Obviously, American producers, I know last time your argument is that liquefied natural gas kind of offsets any reduction in the price of oil, or at least will at some point. But will these oil wells, if they become more viable, how much of that then comes online? How long does it take for U.S. domestic production to increase in light of the increased prices that make it more economically viable in the short term, before all the LNG infrastructure is built out to have these residual benefits?
All things being equal, U.S. producers are staring at a massive win-win situation. Price of oil goes up, price of LNG goes up. The U.S. gets to produce more oil, and the LNG market is there to absorb it, especially if Qatar gets cut off. And so the two are linked. And the place where they're most predominantly linked on the production side is the US because of associated gas production, like we talked about before. So if we wake up tomorrow and oil is 150 and LNG is, equally off the charts, to the extent that they're allowed to take advantage of those prices, US producers could see a significant windfall. Now, it could be that the president, in concurrent with sort of export bans, also imposes domestic rationing. Now, these things are on the table. And so, to the extent that US consumer demand is de-emphasized and military demand is prioritized, you could see more of that incremental production being allowed to be exported to help out our European allies in particular, who would be in the hurt locker. I mean, I'm not sure if I said this the last time on the show, but if you just look at Europe, last year it consumed 36 exajoules of hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal, and it only produced 6 exajoules. So it imports like 30 exajoules of hydrocarbons, which is roughly the entire size of the US natural gas production. And that's just crazy. And they are extremely vulnerable if things go haywire in the Middle East, especially with, the Russian bear, on their borders and outproducing all of NATO's weaponry by a factor of 3 to 4. That's what makes this latest adventure so mysterious. And I know you've covered this extensively. Like, there's a global shortage there's a Western shortage of air defense missiles. Ukraine is a big loser in all of this, of course, as U.S. reroutes limited supplies to its ally in the Middle East, Israel. And of course, Zelensky's been all over social media and doing various interviews, loudly lamenting this fact, and plays directly into Russia's hands. So if you want to talk about another winner, Russia, totally self-sufficient across everything. The sanctions have toughened them, and they're outproducing NATO, and they're sitting there now with their current adversary, their direct adversary, substantially weakened. And so there's a really chaotic set of outcomes. But, the U.S. in isolation it's got a very, very strong hand here from the energy perspective.
Indeed. In terms of the other infrastructure in the region, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is one thing, but then there's the taking the Iranian oil offline entirely, potentially, because they're currently doing strikes with that are seemingly effective on Iranian oil and gas infrastructure throughout the region. What are the kinetic threats to other countries that are outside of this current conflict? What could that have on the price of oil? Because I think we're talking about a closure, but we're not talking about Saudi Aramco getting bombed again yet. We're not talking about offshore rigs being hit by drones. I think all of these things are potentially going to happen. And if we do get in a full-on shooting war, which seems insane because, of course, the Chinese have a vested interest in this not happening. So I would presume they would want to keep the fighting at a level where where the Iranians didn't have to play that card. But again, that could be Iran's way of saying that either you have to support us or else, kind of holding the world hostage in a sense. Because that really is their only, at least as far as I can see, it's either that or doing a nuclear test that could establish some meaningful kind of deterrence, because they do have the power to do that. And that presumes, however, that the United States, who really are the ones who are in charge here, care that the price of oil goes up, because as you've stated, they could nationalize their oil. They have oil, the Chinese don't. So it's almost in their interest, if they want to, avoid the Thucydides trap, to basically create a monopoly on energy in the Middle East, cut China out completely, not only from the Iranian oil, but potentially from the Saudi oil. But the first question is with respect to, what would the biggest targets, do you think, would there be for the Iranians if they decided to, start targeting other countries' oil and gas?
So that would be a giant step. So to the premise of your question, direct Iranian production coming offline predominantly hurts Iran first and then China second. But if it's just that and there's no counterpunch, that's a very manageable issue. Russia could probably more than offset, no, or at least partially offset to China what China needs in a way that would keep the situation relatively under control. It's the counterpunch that you're discussing that is the real risk. And that is a giant step for Iran to take that is almost irreversible. Because then truly, gloves are off and you're into like tactical nuke territory and
just to add to that though, Saudi Arabia, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, has already either hosted refueling tankers or is in the process of getting tankers into their airspace or facilitating that should the need arise. So clearly they would be in the crosshairs, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I mean, they're involved. The question is, what does Iran do, right? To your exact question. Now, targets, pretty apparent, the super mega giant fields of Saudi Arabia, Ras Tanura in Qatar, like I talked about, closing the Strait. There's a significant amount of production in places like Iraq and even some in Syria. There's a lot of damage could be done, but the flip side as well, let's not forget Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has attempted to blow up the Turk Stream natural gas pipeline, which takes Russian natural gas under the sea into Turkey on its way into Europe. In all of these scenarios, one of the big losers, aside from the countries directly involved in the kinetic conflict, is Europe. If I were the president or prime minister of a European country, I would be very, very concerned about these developments, much more concerned than we saw expressed, say, at the G7 and near where you are earlier. So, but I don't know that Iran wants to go there, and I'm convinced that China it would be making as a condition of any military support, which is undoubtedly giving, that they wouldn't do such a thing. The continued military support from China would probably rest upon a vow from Iran that they would not attack those facilities in any scenario, because there are no winners in that. It's just spreading the loss around. This is why, we were so surprised that the war broke out, because these options are there, and losing wars are hard. So if you push Iran to the brink, what's to stop them from pressing that button? And because if they're going to go down, you may as well bring everybody else with them. But as we see these reports, at least, again, online, open source, of military cargo planes landing in Iran from China, I don't think China would like their weapons to be used against its own national interests. And clearly, China, perhaps less so than Europe, but still quite extensively, is interested in making sure that the oil continues to flow to that region.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, regional dominance. And right now, the Saudis are sitting pretty with respect to, they almost need an Iranian enmity for leverage, because as soon as the Iranian nemesis disappears, then they don't really need the Saudis as much as they perhaps once did. So they could, if they wanted to do regime change, they kind of lose a bit of leverage if there's no counterbalance in the region. And so I just wonder, if I can understand why there's a war happening, because they want to totally dominate the region. Look, if you can't fight the Chinese directly, what can you do? Well, you can hit them where it hurts, and that is to try to completely control the Middle East. And Iran really is the last man standing on that front. And so if they get rid of Iran, then it's, they could have total control over the region. So this would potentially not just cut China out of the Iranian oil market, but down the road, they could do something that might cut them out of the Saudi market as well, or they could dictate the terms, because there wouldn't be that competition between the Iranians and the Saudis, if that makes sense.
This is where the strategic ties between Russia and China become vitally important. So just to give you a small sampling of how complex this is, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the war in Ukraine has been India, because it has taken cheap, ghost fleet Russian oil, refined it and sold it at market prices and made a good profit and satisfied its own needs and so on and so on. India and Pakistan, of course, are heating up, and Pakistan and China are close. And in a world where the U.S. leans on India to support Israel at the expense of Iran, you could imagine a scenario where Russia diverts oil that was going to India and it goes into China to plug China's holes. And so then you end up in a scenario where all the natural gas that used to go to Europe from Russia ends up one way or the other going to China, and a bunch of Russia's oil ends up going to China. And Russia has an enormous resource and reserve base of oil and could probably amp up production, certainly with Chinese help. And then in the long run, in the scenario that you're painting, where Saudi Arabia begins to de-emphasize its sales to China, by the way, there's no sign of that. And but if they were to do that under U.S. pressure, you would end up just bifurcating the world, which leads me to another potential model to look at this conflict, which is it's the second phase of World War III, and it's a war over the dollar with the Western world going to war with BRICS, because you have Russia, Iran, the Pakistan-India conflict could be seen as part of that. Obviously, China. There's a lot of tensions with Brazil. It's all the tech oligarchs, going to war with the judge in Brazil, whose name escapes me, and then the sanctions in South Africa might take on a different meaning in that kind of a model, where you're basically, who knows how historians will write about this period of time in 20 years. It wasn't clear when World War II started at the moment. It was clear when it started in Europe, but historians say it started in the 30s when Japan invaded China. If this is World War III, the opening battle was Russia-Ukraine. The next phase is Israel-Iran, and then of course the final battle would be the U.S. and China, with perhaps Taiwan being a proximate cause.
Interesting. What do you think the impacts of such a high rise in the oil price? Like, let's just say this thing flares up, which it probably will, and the United States gets involved and they start hammering the Iranian nuclear sites, military sites, oil refineries. Iran's options then are to retaliate on Israel, American bases throughout the region. Things potentially escalate, or they just, fizzle out, and the United States does their air campaign, and in the same way that they, did with the Houthis, they walk away from it afterwards. That they're satisfied with suppressing, or subduing the Iranians for a short period of time. If oil prices, what do you think the oil price would be? And what effect would that have on the broader economy as a whole, like in terms of just pricing and inflation and all that stuff?
So look, in the scenario you paint, where we don't all end up dead from a full exchange of nuclear weapons, I think you're looking at, Great Reset, fourth turning type scenario. It's hard to imagine that the debt-laden Western economies are going to survive the economic convulsions that would come from $150, $200, $300 a barrel, equivalent prices for LNG, at a minimum, deep recession / depression. That's a pretty scary set of scenarios. Of course, at some point, it all rebounds. And look, Germany and Japan were destroyed in World War II, and then they went on to become, incredibly strong and sophisticated economies over a period of decades. But that path function, again, sort of that event horizon, is very difficult to model. When the laws of physics break down at a singularity, what's on the other side is very difficult to model. Those are scenarios that we hope we don't see. But like with the U.S. debt situation, for example, if we do see an economic collapse, it's hard to see how there isn't just sort of the debt jubilee and a remarking and a reordering of the entire global financial system, and a bifurcation of it along the lines that I was just talking about, potentially, where global trade is not taken for granted, and your geopolitical power is a derivative of your local domestic manufacturing and energy power, which the U.S. has energy in abundance, and Trump has been urgently trying to recreate the manufacturing side of things. In that case, the combination of Russia-China is pretty strong, if we're being honest. Militarily,
so you think that the high price of oil could be what causes a big financial implosion? Because obviously they gave up on Doge, and
Yeah.
the deficit is still increasing, the debt's still increasing. So you think that this could be the trigger that collapses it?
Well, I mean, China dumps its treasuries, you know, global economic tailspin, receipts drop, stock market crashes, which of course is directly correlated to tax receipts. Stimulative measures are in place to try to take care of people like they did during COVID. It gets all kind of scary, right? At some
Right.
point. And so
Stimmy checks.
stimmy checks for everybody
World
alongside
War
gas.
III stimmy checks with Trump's face on it, a golden.
Right. I mean, you know, then everyone pivots to a war economy. But the thing about this that makes it different, of course, is it's the nuclear age, right? So you can't really look at World War II as a proper analogy. But you know, we like everybody else are just struggling for the right analogies and trying our best to understand the potential scenarios. Let's hope we don't face them. But yeah, again, there won't be a global oil price. First of all, in the scenario you're painting, there will be regional huge price disparities, and then we'll see all the black market arbitrage folks trying to get in there, and all kinds of corruption and all the things that you see during such emergencies.
That would be
so,
such a huge shift to not have a global oil price.
Well, technically we don't. I mean, there's probably 10 grades of oil that trade in pretty high volume that in aggregate sort of make up the oil price, but WTI and Brent trade differently. They're separate contracts.
But they're pretty, like they're correlated. They're at parity, right?
So it's a very good question, Nate. So if you actually plot a 10-year chart of the two of them, there's times where they diverge, which is why we're looking at that delta. You know, for example, during the global energy crisis, all kinds of things that are typically correlated suddenly diverged. LNG in Asia versus LNG in Europe. The price of coking coal versus the price of coal, they actually inverted, which was crazy. The value of natural gas was much higher. landed LNG in Europe than the price of oil at its peak during the crisis. LNG in Europe was trading for $600 a barrel oil, energy equivalent. It's unheard of. We're not there yet. So again, when we look at stresses, we look at the delta between Brent and WTI. We look at the energy corrected price of LNG versus Brent.
So
and
that
those are all correlating.
That divergence is correlated with volatility.
It potentially, or for example, export controls like we've been talking about. So if like WTI is primarily an American product and Trump says we're not going to export oil anymore, you could see a glut here, which Trump would want, lower prices, and a huge disparity between the Brent contract and the WTI contract. We're not seeing that today. That's one of our market milestones for true crisis, is when things start trading out of whack with what equilibrium says they should be. We're not seeing that yet either between LNG and Brent or between Brent and WTI. That's today. You could also see big divergence in crack spreads. So what are refineries getting paid to take oil and turn it into useful products? If the market is thinking that the Chinese refinery is about to be shorted, you could see American crack spreads skyrocket as the market is trying to incentivize U.S. refineries to run at full steam. And then suddenly Trump puts export controls on those products and then they crash. It is truly sort of a classic nonlinear chaotic system, which can be quite challenging to model.
How do you think, if the Iranian war is related to China and energy, how do you think that would factor into these trade talks? Do you think there's going to be a trade deal, or is this are the Chinese going to view this as an attack against their economy?
Yeah, this is the whole other side of the equation that the neocons perpetually underestimate, which is, and we've been chronicling and you've been chronicling over the decades, is China's monopoly control over critical minerals, critical metals, various other important supply chains that we in the West have allowed them to take advantage of. We wrote a piece probably 18 months ago, 2 years ago, called Geopolitical Warfare, where we made the case that China was willing to pollute and degrade its environment for geopolitical reasons, and Western environmentalists were not. And therefore, China came to dominate magnesium and aluminum and rare earth metals and the whole entire solar supply chain. And then they get us hooked on solar, and now we find out that they have these devices embedded in some of these electronics that could be a kill switch. And they steal all of our chip technology and then develop it themselves. They have critical in the batteries, magnets for motors. China owns a lot of these supply chains, and with the flip of a switch, could shut off the West. And so this is the thing about war. When we listen to Lindsey Graham talk, like Lindsey Graham always assumes nobody could punch back. You know what I mean? Like when you step up to somebody at a bar and you're fixing for a fight, the first thing you do is size up the person, right? Okay, it looks like they've been going to the gym. They're pretty strong. Maybe they got a Hell's Angels logo on the back of their jean jacket, and you look around the bar, there's 10 other guys in there with Hell's Angels jean jackets on. You're just going to walk up to that guy and cold cock him and think that nothing's going to happen. This is the part that I can't say that I understand how we got here. Like the West ceded enormous leverage to China. And then suddenly everyone in Washington is talking about going to war with China and how Iran is just a stepping stone to a war with China. Like, who says we're going to win a war with China? That they outproduce us across multiple dimensions. We joke half-heartedly that the new arsenal of democracy is China, that they make an enormous number of weapons that Western militaries, and key parts of the supply chain that Western militaries rely on. What are we thinking? What is Lindsey Graham thinking? Honestly, I don't get it.
Well, I think these operations that we've seen run seemingly coordinated between, you had the Russia nuclear base attack, which was very similar and planned on a very similar timeline, as was the attack on Iran and even the attack on Hezbollah. If that is the recipe, then maybe they're thinking that's what they're going to do with China as well. I suspect that they perhaps believe that they can not engage directly in a war, but that they have some plan to subvert or do some sort of James Bond type decapitation on all these countries. I think that's maybe what they're banking on. But yeah, when I hear Lindsey Graham talk, all I hear is like a chihuahua barking, because
it's amazing.
There's just, I mean, he could not contain his alacrity for when this thing started to pop off. It was something to be seen. And I too was, the only thing I was surprised about is how quick it happened, how quick Trump became the war president. I knew he was going to be. I mean, I knew that that operation in itself, the fact that its planning extended across presidencies, kind of shows you the continuity of foreign policy. Regardless of who was going to enter into the office, the Israelis had this operation planned to execute, whether it was Kamala Harris or, Donald Trump. But, well, give me your Doomberg scenario and your Bloomberg scenario. What's the worst case scenario here, and what's the Bloomberg scenario? And just to be clear, your Doomberg is a play on Bloomberg, right?
Sort of. It's doom scrolling, and news, but not Bloomberg, and green chicken and all that stuff. The Doomberg gets a Chicken Little gets a terminal was one of our first sort of brand taglines as a bit of a joke. Everybody loves their Bloomberg terminal. But to your question, so absent, total nuclear, full exchange, take that one off the board, because who cares, right? It's sort of Pascal's wager. Why are we going to bet against the existence of God at this point? The doomy scenario, actually, to follow your train of thought that you just articulated, we thinking that we can decapitate all these countries. Who do you think has better internal counterintelligence security? The combination of China and Russia with their iron-tight control over their domestic populations, or the U.S.? Like, we're a sieve. We have millions and millions and millions of undocumented immigrants, many of whom are military-aged men who crossed over the border during Biden's administration. Who knows how many of them are sleeper cells? The U.S. is, and by extension, of course, Canada's electricity grid is extremely vulnerable. I was just driving through Canada, and you go through Ontario, and you see like mile after mile after mile of these massive, transmission lines taking electricity from nuclear power plants and moving it all over the province. Or you drive through Quebec and you see the massive hydro and transmission lines feeding New York. Like, these are all out in the open. They're unguarded. They're totally soft targets. And if you have millions of undocumented military-aged men roaming around the country waiting to get that signal to go, again, back to the point, like other countries can punch back. China has, Iran has, Russia has substantial cyber attack capabilities. I think the U.S. government has shown that it is a particularly soft target in this regard. It's not something that gets widely reported, but a grid down scenario like you've been warning about and we've been preparing about for many, many years is totally on the board. People punch back. Like if Lindsey Graham gets his way, he probably won't be doing the good people of South Carolina a favor.
And what is so what would, in that scenario, if we do see this thing really go overkill, what kind of price of oil are we looking at here?
Yeah, again, depends on where you are, but yeah, in our view,
Right.
125, 150 is not on the table. And that wouldn't hardly be a all-time high, by the way, let alone an inflation-adjusted one. So if you go to the all-time high and you inflate it, maybe 200, 250, but that doesn't stay there for long.
And that is with a Strait of Hormuz closure?
Or a series of attacks and escalations, on infrastructure and things that we've been talking about. But it can't stay there for long because the economies would collapse. And so that's the thing about these spikes is they're always followed by gluts, either because supply comes on and rushes back on or because the economy tanks and demand folds. So that's like the Doomberg scenario. I don't know what the Bloomberg scenario is because I just don't see.
Well, would the economy collapse though? Because if you're saying that, like, what was the all-time high in oil price?
Just before the global financial crisis. It's no coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was what caused, well, it wasn't the only thing that caused it. Was obviously the banking, housing bust, but
cause and effect in chaotic systems is difficult to tie directly. All I can tell you is that the price of oil peaked at $145 nominal just before the global financial crisis. And within a year, it was back to 35.
So there's something about that price range then that the system becomes unstable?
Sure. Look, energy is life. The economy and the currencies and everything that we follow are all derivatives of energy transactions. The human endeavor requires energy every day. Your body, your home. Entropy is a penalty that must be paid for elevated standards of living. And so when the lifeblood of humanity gets radically expensive, the life stops, right? In a way. And so at the very, very high level, you would see a global financial crisis type scenario, except the Western countries and even China have far more debt now than they did in 0809. So the Federal Reserve was able to plug the gap both then and during COVID. It doesn't quite have the dry powder that it does. So you're looking at inflating away the debt, basically hyperinflation. Or economies collapse so much that you have, deflation. But either way, neither scenario is very good. And so the global financial crisis, I think, is an example of what happens when energy prices skyrocket. Yeah. I mean, when there's ample supply of energy and the prices are normal, you could treat them like other commodities. But in a true shortage, the inelasticity of demand for such nourishment, life necessity, food, fertilizer, electricity, all those things suddenly go limit, full tilt. And the richest people of the world set the marginal price. And so then you're looking at all manner of government revolutions in the global south and regimes that may have been teetering suddenly collapse, and then those have cascading effects that are very difficult to predict. But yeah, there are no good scenarios in a super spike of oil, because what usually follows is a collapse in the economy.
And it's a positive feedback loop because you have a situation where oil prices spike, the price of everything goes up, which increases social instability and civil unrest, which I suspect that the trial balloon of deploying the government overreach of this No King protest with respect to deploying National Guardsmen and Marines in the streets was somewhat preempting some instability as a result of anti-war protests, maybe. Maybe that's looking a little too far ahead. But it seems to be a positive feedback loop in that, okay, oil price is going to increase, the price of everything correspondingly is going to increase. Food prices are going to increase. And that's going to just cause people to become very stressed, and which will lead to more tensions internally, which could, I suppose, lead to even more geopolitical crisis, like India and Pakistan fighting over water even more, or, choose your African country fighting over water rights. It just seems like these things it's a potentially vicious cycle that is being initiated here that ends in total disaster or a great reset, as you say. Is there is there a silver lining here? Is there, for the people who like happy endings, because in America we like to delude ourselves. So what's the happy ending? What's the Bloomberg scenario?
Yeah, it's hard to see how likely it is, but obviously the Bloomberg scenario is a swift negotiated settlement as cooler heads prevail. I don't see too many cool heads in this scenario. Look, I mean, the Samson option for Israel is there for a reason. The Ayatollah was out with some very strong counter responses to Trump's Truth Social barrage of yesterday. I'd look at a negotiated scenario where Russia mediates, takes the enriched uranium, agrees to supply Iran with civilian reactors and the fuel for it, and there's U.S. and international inspections. Hard to see that absent a regime change, and then hard to see a regime change ending any differently than all of the other U.S. Color revolutions and the chaos that those have sowed. And there's already talk about, the neocons' desire to split Iran into 6 different countries and to federalize the country in the way they claim they want to do Russia. So China and Russia will be highly resistant to regime change. And so I don't know that there is a Bloomberg scenario. I sure hope there is, by the way. We are anti-war, strongly anti-war, unabashedly anti-war over here. Not that we are the majority opinion, and not that Fox News would ever have us on, but that is our view. But a world where, because Putin has and Russia has good contacts between Israel for historical reasons and Iran for strategic reasons, and they are now talking with the U.S., there's a role where maybe if we have your European viewers plug their ears, where Putin could actually be a mediator and de-escalation off-ramps are found, and China and Russia guarantee to the U.S. and to Israel that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, and everybody agrees that the mission is accomplished. Trump gets a safe face, Netanyahu gets a safe face. But by the way, it's not clear that the political situation in Israel is all that stable either, depending on which footage you see online. So that would be the path out. I don't know that anybody is motivated to take that path. And I keep coming back to how hard it is to end wars, which is why you need a much, much higher barrier to start them.
Especially when you no longer trust the IAEA because you think they're sending the information to the Israelis.
Well, let's look at Trump. I mean, the U.S. and Iran were scheduled to negotiate the Sunday before this lit off. And there's credible reports in Western media that this was a purposeful deception. Well, who's going to negotiate with Trump?
It was perfidy.
Yeah. But there's consequences for that, Nate. Does
and
Russia believe Trump?
They're doing it today again. Apparently, the buzz is, as we're talking here, that Witkoff and Aragachi have been speaking, and that there is a meeting ongoing in Geneva right now. But if I'm the Iranians, I mean, I should be looking over my shoulder at this point in time.
I mean, they did assassinate the chief negotiator.
Exactly. So, I'm very pessimistic or realistic about what could potentially unfold here, but you never know. You just never know with Trump. But I think that if they genuinely wanted to, I don't think they would have made the commitment and investments that they have so far to make all these moves in terms of forward deploying all these military assets, the aircraft carriers, the evacuations. It doesn't seem like it's gotten so much inertia right now that I don't know if you can turn that ship around, even if you wanted to. There's so many military interests now, corporate interests, and of course the Israelis, who will continue to escalate to ensure that we get ensnared in that conflict. And there seemingly is support for it in Congress, even though the left is positioning themselves as the anti-war party again. I think there's probably enough support within the Democrats in Congress to approve this. So, yeah. But sorry to rain on your Bloomberg parade there. I'm the one who asked you for the positive, and here I go prepper talk on you.
I like me some prepper talk, so you're all good.
All right, man. Well, hey, it's been great having you on today. And where can people find you? On Substack, I presume.
Yeah, Doomberg.com, one-stop shop for all of our articles, our pro-tier webinars, our podcast appearances such as this. Nate, a couple more appearances, and I'm going to start calling myself the official energy correspondent of the Canadian Prepper channel.
That'd be great.
Which I'd put on my resume as a badge of honor. It's been great talking to you and always happy to chat. I wish we could sometimes discuss things during more normal times, but this is where we are.
Absolutely. I still want to mediate a debate between you and Nate Hagens. I've been trying to nudge him. I'm like, come on, just come back on for a little bit.
Nate's a great guy. I love Nate. And if we did debate, it would be cordial, intellectual, and it would be quite fun.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll let you get back to the chicken coop, and we'll see you on the flip side.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.